About a year ago, I was sitting at a kitchen table with my friend Pete, who was 51 at the time, and we were doing the one exercise that I think everyone should do at least once in their life, and almost nobody does. We were calculating his actual financial picture on a single sheet of paper. Income, savings, debts, projected retirement, the works. By the end of 45 minutes, Pete looked up from the page with an expression I have seen many times on people in their 40s and 50s, which is the look of someone who is realizing simultaneously that the situation is both worse than they thought and also more fixable than they assumed. Pete said something I have not stopped thinking about since. He said, "Tom, I went to college. I have a graduate degree. I've been working for 30 years, and nobody has ever once shown me how to actually do this. Why is that?" I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance, the kind that actually works for normal people, instead of the kind that gets you to click on a thumbnail. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, no get rich quick. Just what the math actually does over time. If that's what you want, hit subscribe. According to the latest TIAA Institute and FINRA Financial Literacy Survey, the typical U.S. adult answers correctly only about 48% of basic personal finance questions. Half of all adults cannot pass a test that measures whether you understand the financial system you have been operating inside for your entire adult life. Today I'm going to do something I have been avoiding for a while, which is take everything I would actually want my younger self, my older self, and my friend Pete to know about money and condense it into a single video. Most personal finance content on YouTube tries to cover this in 50 or 60 minutes by walking through every topic encyclopedically. I think that's the wrong approach. After years of watching what actually moves the needle for people, I think there are 7 specific truths that, if you understand them, do almost all of the work. Everything else is decoration on top of these 7. We're going to walk through them in order in the next 30 minutes. Some of them you've heard. Most of them, in this exact form, you haven't. The first truth: your savings rate matters more than your income. The single most expensive misconception in personal finance is that wealth is determined by income. It isn't. Wealth is determined by the gap between what comes in and what goes out, and what you do with that gap. Income is one input to the gap. The other inputs, which most people ignore, are at least as important. Here's the math that proves this. Imagine 2 people. Person A earns $80,000 a year and saves 5% of it, which works out to about $333 a month. Person B earns $50,000 a year and saves 20%, which is about $833 a month. Person A has a 60% higher income. Person B is investing 2.5 times as much money each month. Run both of them out 30 years at a 7% real return, and Person A ends up with about $406,000. Person B ends up with about $1,016,000. The lower income person ends up with more than 2.5 times the wealth, despite earning meaningfully less, because the savings rate is doing more work than the income. This is the part that almost nobody internalizes correctly. When you ask most people how they would build wealth, they say, "I need to make more money." That answer is not wrong, but it's incomplete, and frequently it's actually a distraction. Almost everyone who gets a raise expands their lifestyle to absorb most or all of it within 12 months, which means the higher income produces no additional wealth. The savings rate stayed the same. The lifestyle just got more expensive. My friend David told me once that he's been running an income-first split since his 20s. The first thing that happens on payday isn't bill payment, it's savings. A fixed percentage comes off the top before the household's bills are even looked at, and what's left over becomes the operating budget for the month. I made a whole video about David's specific system on this channel if you want the full breakdown. The point for our purposes today is that David has held his lifestyle essentially flat through 3 jobs and 2 promotions. And the gap between what he earns and what he spends keeps widening, which is doing more for his retirement than any specific stock pick or market timing decision could ever do. The takeaway is simple, but it's the one almost everyone hears as obvious and then ignores. Your wealth trajectory is determined by the percentage of your income you don't spend, which means it isn't determined by your salary, your investment returns, or your job title. The savings rate is the lever, and the lever works the same regardless of what your income is. The number to actually pay attention to on your own paycheck is what percentage you're saving. Below 10% is where every other piece of financial advice should be filtered through. Above 20%, and you're already winning, and the question becomes how to keep it there as your income grows. The second truth. The 7% line decides everything about debt. There is a single number that once you internalize it, settles 90% of the arguments about whether you should pay off debt or invest. That number is 7%. Any debt with an interest rate above 7% should be eliminated before you put $1 into voluntary investments, because the guaranteed return from killing that debt is higher than what you can reasonably expect from the market after accounting for taxes and risk. Anything below 7% can usually sit there while you invest, because investments will, over a long enough horizon, outpace it. This is why credit card debt is financial poison. The average credit card APR in 2026 is sitting around 21%. If you carry a $5,000 balance at 21% and only make minimum payments, you will pay roughly $1,050 a year just in interest, year after year, while you are simultaneously trying to invest in retirement accounts that earn 7% on average. The math is not on your side. Every year on the credit card, you lose 14 percentage points and earn 7 on the investments. You are running negative on the spread, and the longer you do it, the more you compound the damage. The fix is not psychological complexity. It's simple ordering. If you have any debt above the 7% line, that gets attacked first, with 2 specific exceptions. The first exception is that you should always capture any employer match in your retirement plan first, because that is typically a 50 to 100% instant return, which is mathematically larger than even the worst credit card. The second exception is that you should keep at least a small cash buffer, somewhere around $1,000 to $2,000, so a flat tire doesn't push you back into more debt while you're trying to dig out. Beyond those 2 exceptions, the rule is simple. Above 7%, kill it. Below 7%, leave it alone and invest. Most personal finance arguments online about whether to pay off the mortgage early or pay down student loans collapse the moment you apply this single line. For people in their 50s watching this who are carrying any kind of high-interest debt, this rule is even sharper. You have less time to recover from leaving high-interest debt in place. Every year you carry a $10,000 credit card balance at 21% in your 50s is $2,100 of interest that could otherwise have been a $2,100 catch-up contribution. The line doesn't change with age. The cost of ignoring it gets worse with age. The third truth. There's a smartest order to invest, and it shifts at every life stage. Once your high-interest debt is handled and you have a small cash cushion, the question becomes where to put each new dollar. There's a roughly universal order that works for most people. Capture your employer match first, eliminate any debt above 7%, then max out your IRA, because the investment options are better and the fees are lower than your 401k. Then complete a full emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of expenses. Then go back and max out your 401k up to the annual limit. Then anything beyond that goes into a regular taxable brokerage account. That's the framework. What almost nobody on YouTube explains is that the order doesn't change as you age, but which steps inside it have the most leverage absolutely does. If you're in your 20s or 30s, the most valuable step is the Roth IRA, because you have 30 plus years for tax-free growth, which is the most valuable structure in the entire system. By the time you're in your 40s, the most valuable steps shift to killing debt and maxing your 401k at the higher contribution rate that high earners can sustain. At 50 or older, the order opens up two specific tools that don't exist for younger savers. Catch-up contributions raise your 401k limit from $24,500 to $32,500, and your IRA limit from $7,000 to $8,000. And under Secure 2.0, anyone between 60 and 63 sees their 401k limit jump even higher to $35,750. Almost nobody uses these. Per Vanguard's most recent How America Saves report, fewer than 15% of eligible workers max out their catch-up. The IRAs literally built a back door specifically for people who started late, and most people walk past it. The reason this matters more than any specific investment recommendation is that the same dollar put in the wrong account first can cost you tens of thousands of dollars over a career. Pete had been contributing to his 403b without ever opening an IRA, which meant he was paying significantly higher fees than he needed to and missing the better investment options that an IRA gives you. The fix took him about 15 minutes online. The fee savings, projected over the rest of his working life, was somewhere north of $40,000. 15 minutes for $40,000? The order isn't optional, and you can't outrun a wrong order by just contributing more money. The fourth truth: time, not return, is the lever that does almost all the work. This is the truth that, more than any other in this video, separates the people who end up financially comfortable from the people who don't. It is not your investment returns that determine your wealth. The lever is the number of years you give those returns to compound. The math is genuinely shocking. Imagine 3 people, each contributing exactly $300 a month into the exact same total stock market index fund, earning the exact same 7% real return. The only thing that differs between them is when they start. The first person starts at 25 and contributes until 65, a 40-year window. The second starts at 35 and contributes until 65, 30 years. The third starts at 45 and contributes until 65, 20 years. Same monthly contribution, same fund, same return. The first person ends up with about $787,000. The second person ends up with about $366,000. The third person ends up with about $156,000. That is a 5-fold difference between the 25-year-old and the 45-year-old, even though the 25-year-old only contributed 20 more years of payments. Whew. Compounding does not work linearly. It works exponentially. And the exponential part happens at the end of the curve, which means the people who started early get to ride the steepest part of the curve, while the late starters miss it entirely. This is why, should I be picking growth stocks or buying Bitcoin, is almost always the wrong question. The variance between a 7% return and a 9% return over 30 years is real, but it's much smaller than the variance between starting at 25 and starting at 35. Starting earlier with a boring index fund will beat starting later with a brilliant stock picking strategy almost every time. The most expensive financial decision you can make is not which fund to choose. It's waiting until you feel ready before you start. For people in their 40s and 50s watching this, who feel like the time leverage truth means it's too late, here's the part that matters. The time leverage truth doesn't mean you can't catch up. It means you have to use the specific tools that exist for late starters, which are catch-up contributions, coast-fire math, and aggressive savings rates in your highest earning years. The math gets harder, but it doesn't get impossible. Sam, my old coworker, didn't start saving aggressively until he was 33, and he still hit financial independence by 38 by running a 5-year sprint at a 75% savings rate. He used the levers that were specifically available to a late starter with a high income. The point isn't that everyone should do what Sam did. It's that the time leverage truth doesn't write off late starters. It just changes which lever is available. There's a related point worth making for anyone in their 50s who's been told their entire adult life that they should have started earlier. You probably should have started earlier. Almost everyone should have. But the math at 50 is genuinely better than most 50-somethings believe. Even 15 years of consistent contributions at the catch-up level, combined with whatever you already have invested, produces a portfolio that, when you subtract Social Security from your retirement target, often gets you to the finish line. The shame and the urgency I see 50-somethings carry around about being behind is, in most cases, larger than the actual gap. The gap is real. It's just smaller than the feeling. And the feeling is partly what kept you from running the numbers in the first place, which is the loop that has to break before anything else can change. The fifth truth: the retirement number you've been told to fear is almost certainly wrong. The Northwestern Mutual 2026 Planning and Progress Study reported that the typical U.S. household believes they need $1.46 million to retire comfortably. That number is up 15% from last year, and it is the highest target Americans have ever named in this survey. If you are 50 or 55 and somewhere south of $200,000 in retirement savings, the math of getting to $1.46 million feels like trying to dig your way to the moon with a teaspoon. Most people, after running their first calculation, quietly close the spreadsheet and decide retirement is something that happens to other people. Here's what the magic number conversation always leaves out. The actual amount you need invested to retire is, for most Americans, dramatically less than $1.46 million, because the calculation Americans use is wrong by design. The standard retirement number is calculated by taking your gross monthly expense, multiplying by 12, then by 25. That gives you the number that scares everyone. The correct calculation takes your gross monthly expense, subtracts your expected Social Security income, subtracts any pension or other guaranteed income, and only then multiplies by 25. The difference between those two methods is enormous. Take a 65-year-old couple with $6,000 a month in expenses. The standard calculation gives a portfolio target of $1.8 million. The correct calculation, after subtracting average household Social Security of about $3,500 a month, gives a portfolio target of $750,000. That's not a small adjustment. That's a $1 million reduction in your retirement target, which is the difference between feeling hopeless and feeling like you have a real plan. The Social Security you've been paying into for 30 or 40 years is real income, indexed to inflation, that does not require you to fund it from a portfolio. Most retirement calculators ignore this entirely, which means they're measuring the wrong thing for almost everyone using them. I ran this exact calculation with Pete a year ago, and you can see the full breakdown in the $1,000 per month rule video on this channel. The short version is that Pete's real target turned out to be a fraction of the $1.46 million he'd been carrying around in his head, and he's actually closer to retirement than he realized. The reason most retirement content quietly skips this conversation is that the conversation that involves subtracting Social Security from your target is less marketable than the conversation that produces a 7-figure scary number. Scary numbers sell financial products. Real numbers, calculated honestly, often reveal that the situation is more workable than the industry wants you to believe. For people who are watching this and have always assumed they were behind, run the corrected calculation tonight. Your monthly expenses, minus your expected Social Security at 67, minus any pension, times 12, times 25. The number that comes back will probably be less than half of whatever you've been carrying around in your head. That doesn't mean retirement is automatic. It means your real target is achievable by people who are not extraordinary, which describes most of us watching this video. The sixth truth: lifestyle inflation will eat every raise you ever get unless you stop it on purpose. Of all the financial behaviors that quietly destroy wealth building potential, the most universal and least talked about is lifestyle inflation. The pattern works like this. You get a raise. You feel like you've earned it. You upgrade something, usually housing or a car, sometimes both. Within 6 months, the new lifestyle becomes the baseline. Within 12 months, you can't imagine going back. 3 years later, you get another raise, and the cycle repeats. By the time you're in your late 40s, you're earning 2 or 3 times what you earned in your late 20s, and your savings rate hasn't changed at all. The income went up, the lifestyle went up with it. The gap stayed the same. I had a friend named Will who got a $7,500 bonus 3 years in a row at a marketing job and could not tell me, looking back, what any of it was for. There was no upgrade he could point to, no trip he remembered, no debt he paid off. The money just dissolved into a slightly nicer 6 weeks each time. Better restaurants, Christmas with no checking the price tag, a flight upgrade. None of it felt like spending. That dissolution is the textbook signature of lifestyle inflation. Except it usually doesn't happen as a single bonus event. It happens as the slow upward drift of every category of monthly spending, year after year, that you barely notice because each individual upgrade was small. Will's pattern, multiplied across 10 years of bonuses, was about $75,000 in lump sum income that produced no measurable change in his financial position. If even half of that money had been routed to investments before it landed in his checking account, the same Will, 10 years later, would have an additional $50,000 to $60,000 of compounded retirement assets. The lifestyle that absorbed his bonuses didn't reward him for absorbing them. He can't even remember most of those nicer 6 weeks. The retirement money, if it had been redirected automatically before willpower had a chance to fail, would still be there. Here's the math that nobody runs. Imagine someone who earns $80,000 at 35 and freezes their lifestyle there, even as their income climbs to $100,000, $120,000, and eventually $140,000 over the next 30 years. Every dollar of income above the original $80,000 lifestyle gets invested. That single decision, sustained for 30 years, generates somewhere north of $2 million in retirement assets, because the income climbs, but the spending doesn't. Now imagine the same person, same income trajectory, but they let lifestyle move in lockstep with income. They end up with the same lifestyle they had at 35, just more expensive. And they retire with whatever their employer-matched 401k happened to accumulate, usually somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000. The thing that makes lifestyle inflation so insidious is that each individual upgrade feels small and reasonable. The bigger house instead of the smaller one, the new car instead of the reliable used one, the premium grocery store instead of the regular one. The vacation that used to be camping is now a hotel. None of these decisions in isolation looks like wealth destruction. The accumulated effect is that you traded what could have been 30 years of financial freedom for a slightly nicer life that you got used to so quickly you don't really enjoy anymore. The lifestyle stops giving you happiness within months. The retirement loss compounds for decades. The fix is not deprivation, it's intention. The next raise you get, decide before you receive it what percentage of it goes to investments and what percentage goes to lifestyle. Even a 50-50 split, which most people would consider modest, completely changes the trajectory if you do it consistently. The dollars stay yours instead of dissolving into a slightly more expensive life that doesn't actually feel better. The seventh truth: money is behavior, not knowledge. I want to close this video with the truth that, more than any other, determines whether the previous 6 actually do anything for you. Personal finance is overwhelmingly about behavior. The amount of knowledge you need to manage your money well is small. You can fit it on a single page. The amount of behavioral consistency you need to actually apply that knowledge over 30 years is enormous, and almost no one has it without building specific systems to make it automatic. Almost every financial mistake I have ever watched a friend make, including Pete, including Eason, whose car payment story I told in a different video, including myself, was not a mistake of knowledge. It was a mistake of behavior. Pete knew he should have opened an IRA earlier. He didn't. Eason knew that buying a 4th new car in 15 years was destroying his retirement. He did it anyway. I knew when I bought my first new truck that the math was bad. I bought it anyway. None of us made a knowledge error. We all made behavior errors. The reason behavior is so hard is that the brain that evolved to make daily decisions about food and shelter is genuinely terrible at making decisions about events 30 years away. When you face a choice between buying a $700 car payment now and having $610,000 in retirement assets in 30 years, the brain treats the $700 decision as immediate and the $610,000 outcome as theoretical. The $700 win almost every time, which is why almost nobody runs the math. Knowing the math doesn't help. The math has been available the whole time. The behavior is what didn't show up. The single most useful thing you can do after watching this video is not to learn more. It's to remove decisions from your daily willpower entirely by automating them. The system Pete and I set up that afternoon had 3 things running automatically before he could think about them. His payroll routes a fixed percentage to his 403b before his checking account ever sees it. The day after each paycheck, an automatic transfer moves another fixed amount to a high-yield savings account. And on the same day each month, a fixed contribution flows into his Roth IRA and gets invested in a total stock market index fund without him touching anything. 3 transfers, all automatic, all running at the bank's pace instead of his daily emotional pace. By the time he notices the money has moved, it's already gone, and there's nothing to feel bad about. The decision was already made. The goal of automation is to make the financial behaviors invisible, so they don't have to compete with the daily flood of immediate decisions your brain is wired to lose. People who automate their finances reliably outperform people who try to manage them through willpower, regardless of which group has more knowledge. This is the meta rule that makes the other 6 rules actually work. Let me bring the 7 truths together for a second, because the sequence matters and most people miss how they connect. Your savings rate is the engine. The 7% debt line tells you whether to invest the savings or use it to kill debt first. The order of operations tells you which account each saved dollar should go into, and that order shifts as you age. The time leverage truth tells you that starting earlier multiplies the work the savings rate is doing for you, which is why the order matters so much in your 20s and 30s. The retirement number truth tells you that the target you're aiming the whole system at is probably much smaller than you think, especially after Social Security gets factored in. The lifestyle inflation truth tells you that the savings rate, once established, has to be defended against drift every single year. And the behavior truth tells you that none of the above does anything unless you remove it from willpower and let automation run the system. They're not 7 separate ideas. They're a single system with 7 moving parts, and each one fails if the others aren't holding up their end. That's why most people who try to fix their financial life fail. They pick one truth, usually number 2 or 4, and apply it without the others. The whole system has to run together, or none of it works for long. Pete's situation, by the way, ended up being meaningfully fixable. We sat down at his kitchen table on that Sunday afternoon and applied the 7 truths above. And his projected retirement at 65 went from, "I'm going to work until I die," to a number that gives him real options, including the option to retire on his own terms in his early 60s. Nothing about Pete's income changed, and nothing about his job changed. The only thing that changed was that he ran the right calculations and applied them in the right order. What you just watched, if you actually use it, has the same potential to change your trajectory. Drop a comment with which of the 7 truths landed hardest for you, or with the one that you've been doing wrong the longest. I read every comment, and I'll reply to as many as I can. And if you want me to walk through the specific automation system that Pete and I set up that morning, the one that converts these 7 truths into a system that runs without willpower, hit subscribe because that's the next video. I'll see you in the next one.